before the first coin drops. Tonight, we won't march alongside kings or ride under banners flapping in the wind. No battles, no sieges. Instead, we'll step into something far older, far quieter, and far more profitable. The marketplace. Into narrow streets where spices whisper of distant lands, and where every handshake hides a tiny game of chess. A world where fortunes grow, not from swordplay, but from silver tongues. You see, this isn't a story of grand knights or mighty lords. It's a story of merchants, of men and women who traded cloth, salt, wine, wool, and sometimes questionable honesty for the chance to climb the ladder one coin at a time. Some called them shrewd, some called them thieves. History remembers them as something in between. So before we begin, I invite you to settle in. Let the weight of your day fade like distant chatter from a crowded fair. If you enjoy quiet journeys into forgotten corners of history, consider leaving a like, subscribing, and joining me for future nights of soft, sleepy stories. It helps far more than you imagine. Lights low, sounds soft. The market stalls are opening. The day begins, and somewhere someone is about to haggle just a little too hard. The morning market, where deals awaken. The sun has barely cracked the crooked rooftops of the medieval town. A thin mist clings to uneven cobbles while merchants begin their careful ballet of preparation. Canvas canopies flap, wooden carts creak as wheels bite into muddy ruts. Sacks of grain are stacked like miniature fortresses, each with a price that will change 3 times before noon. Merchants weren't rich by birth. Most began as apprentices, sweeping stalls, counting crates, memorizing which spices looked real and which had been mixed with coloured dust. They learned fast, or they starved. The guild masters taught them 2 lessons above all: buy low, sell high, and always watch the eyes, not the words. The first customers arrive. A nobleman's steward in stiff velvet, pretending not to flinch at the prices. A fisherman with yesterday's catch, hoping to trade for oil. A travelling friar, scanning bolts of cloth while offering blessings he cannot sell. Everyone smiles politely. Everyone lies politely. And behind each smile is an invisible ledger of advantage, inching forward 1 coin at a time. The art of haggling, dance without swords. The true weapon of a medieval merchant wasn't a sword. It was the pause. A carefully timed silence could be worth more than a whole wagon of goods. In the market square, deals rarely happened at first offer. The merchant would feign surprise at a low bid. The customer would pretend to walk away, and both would secretly count how many steps it would take before one turned back. It was a ritual, an unscripted theatre of sighs, shrugs, and furrowed brows. Prices were never truly fixed. A bolt of wool might begin the day at 1 coin per yard, but by sunset, after 3 waves of bargaining and the right amount of flattery, it might move for half or double. Experienced merchants knew how to read the subtle language, how firmly a woman gripped her purse, how wide a man's eyes grew at a price. Desperation was as visible as rain-soaked cloaks, and desperation made discount or opportunities. There was risk, of course. Push too hard and a rival might undercut you within earshot. Worse still, the guild inspectors might wander by. Grim-faced men who watched for forbidden tricks, false weights, stretched measures, or goods cut with fillers. A merchant's survival balanced between boldness and caution. A coin earned dishonestly today could cost him his license tomorrow, and with it his entire livelihood. And yet, in this constant tug of war, there was a strange kind of respect. Buyer and seller both knew the game, both pretended not to. The best deals were sealed with a final nod, a clasped handshake, and a phrase spoken across cultures for centuries: "You drive a hard bargain," which, of course, was exactly the point. Trade was never confined to the market stall. To fill those stalls, merchants had to travel, sometimes for weeks, across muddy tracks, crumbling bridges, and forests thick with uncertainty. The medieval roads were not the picturesque ribbons we imagine today. They were narrow, winding trails carved by hooves, wheels, and luck. Rain turned them to sludge, snow to traps, and spring floods washed them away entirely. Every journey was a gamble. And then there were the tolls. Every lord, every village, every minor baron seemed to own a bridge or a gate, and each demanded a modest fee for safe passage. These weren't standardized tolls, they were improvised on the spot, depending on how wealthy you looked and how desperate the collector felt that day. Refusing to pay wasn't really an option, unless you enjoyed seeing your wagon impounded and your goods confiscated for inspection. Of course, even after paying the tolls, there remained the problem of bandits. Some worked alone, lean, hungry men who hid behind trees and demanded coin with shaking daggers. Others were far more organized, entire gangs who operated like mobile guilds of crime, complete with scouts, lookouts, and occasional political protection. Many lords, unofficially of course, found it useful to turn a blind eye. After all, a frightened merchant was a more generous taxpayer next season. To defend themselves, many merchants travelled in convoys. Caravans of wagons would clump together, pooling coin for armed guards, usually mercenaries with more scars than teeth. But even safety came at a price. Guards might defend your goods, yes, but they also took a hefty cut, and more than one merchant whispered tales of guards who turned on their employers when the road grew quiet enough. In the end, survival wasn't just about who had the strongest sword. It was about knowing which risks were worth paying for, which bribes bought true safety, and which bridges were best avoided entirely. The guild halls, power beyond the market. As the morning matured into noon, many merchants retreated from the crowded market stalls to places of quieter, subtler power, the guild halls. Here, behind heavy oak doors and stained glass windows, decisions were made that would ripple across entire towns. Guilds weren't mere social clubs, they were part union, part cartel, and part city council. Entry was difficult, expensive, and often required the approval of those already inside. But once within, a merchant found protection and influence. Guilds set prices, regulated quality, and enforced standards. A crooked merchant might cheat a customer once, but crossing the guild could end a career. They policed weights, inspected measures, and mediated disputes. They also lobbied the city council, negotiated taxes, and even controlled access to certain ports and trade routes. In many ways, guild halls were medieval stock exchanges, where fortunes rose or fell over quiet discussions and carefully poured goblets of wine. But not all guild decisions were so grand. Some were surprisingly mundane. Arguments over stall placements, quotas for imported salt, disputes over who had the right to sell candles on feast days. Small matters perhaps, but for merchants such details often meant the difference between profit and ruin. And as always, influence spoke louder than fairness. The merchant's family, partners in profit. While the men argued beneath carved beams, many wives and daughters managed the stalls themselves. Medieval trade was often a family affair, with women playing roles far more central than dusty chronicles might suggest. They haggled, negotiated, and sometimes even travelled. A sharp-tongued merchant's wife could drive just as hard a bargain as her husband, and children learned to count coin before they learned to write their name. In some cases, widows inherited entire businesses. A husband lost to fever or highwaymen did not always mean the end of the enterprise. Many guilds allowed widows to continue trading, provided they maintained standards and paid dues. Some became respected merchants in their own right, known for both keen judgment and iron resolve. After all, a soft voice often concealed a ledger balanced to the last fraction. Even children contributed. Young sons might help carry goods, while daughters memorized the weight of proper spices or learned which fabrics fetched higher prices from foreign buyers. The merchant family was not merely surviving together, they were building a small empire, one careful transaction at a time. Crossroads of power, politics and privilege. Merchants were more than just traders, they were political creatures. In many medieval towns, especially in prosperous city-states, wealthy merchants became councilmen, mayors, or even unofficial rulers. Their fortunes brought influence, and influence opened doors that no amount of coin alone could breach. But politics was a game as risky as trade. Rival families vied for power, forming alliances through marriages or secret agreements. A poorly timed insult or a failed investment could quickly turn friends into enemies. And while some merchants rose to dizzying heights, others found themselves ruined. Their warehouses seized, their reputations shattered. Yet even in failure, some retained quiet power. A bankrupt merchant might still have information who owed whom, which alliances were fragile, which guards were bribable. In the world of medieval trade, information was a currency more valuable than gold. Exotic goods and distant shores. The true glory of a merchant's ambition lay not just in local markets, but in far-flung lands. Spices from the Levant, silk from the east, furs from the frozen north, and precious gems from Africa. These were treasures that brought unimaginable profits, if one survived the journey. Merchants funded expeditions across deserts, mountains, and seas. Caravans trudged through dangerous terrain, while ships braved storms and pirates. Trade agreements were brokered in a dozen languages, sealed with handshakes, gifts, or sometimes bribes. A single shipment of rare saffron could fund a merchant's retirement, or his ruin if lost. The dark art of deception. Of course, not every merchant played fair. The art of deception was a shadow trade that flourished in tandem with legitimate business. Adulterated spices, watered wine, short measures, these were common enough. But some scams were more elaborate. There were merchants who sold fake relics, genuine saints' bones that were little more than carved ox femurs. Others created forged contracts or bribed inspectors to pass off inferior goods as premium stock. Occasionally, entire shipments were staged, empty barrels disguised with a layer of valuable goods on top, fooling distant buyers until it was too late. Reputation, however, was everything. A merchant who gained a reputation for fraud would soon find his business evaporate. Thus, the cleverest cheats were subtle, never greedy enough to draw too much attention. They balanced on a tightrope of risk and reward, always calculating how much they could get away with and who might be watching. From apprentice to master, the merchant's journey. Every prosperous merchant began humbly. Apprenticeship was long and grueling. Young hopefuls swept floors, carried ledgers, and memorized complex systems of weights, currencies, and trade laws. They watched their masters haggle, learning the subtle language of negotiation, when to feign offense, when to pause, when to smile. The journey from apprentice to master often took decades. Success demanded more than just knowledge. It required luck, timing, and resilience. Some failed, some thrived, but those who endured joined an unspoken brotherhood of traders who understood that fortune was rarely given, it was built, one calculated risk at a time. The great fairs, where empires met. Beyond the daily bustle of city markets stood the grand international fairs. These seasonal gatherings drew merchants from across kingdoms, forming temporary cities bursting with goods, gossip, and opportunity. The champagne fairs in France, for instance, were famed not just for trade, but for diplomacy, marriages, and sometimes even quiet espionage. Here, silk from China brushed against wool from England, spices from India mingled with glass from Venice. Deals were struck beneath colourful banners as jongleurs performed and noble envoys strolled. Entire fortunes were won or lost over a handshake or a badly translated promise. These fairs were more than commerce. They were cultural crossroads where languages blended and alliances were tested. Many merchants brought their families, turning these weeks into both business ventures and social spectacles. Children played near tents while fathers bargained fiercely within. Merchants and monarchs, the delicate dance. While guilds ruled the city streets, kings and queens kept a close eye on merchant wealth. Monarchs granted trading privileges or revoked them in exchange for loans, favours, or military support. A clever merchant might fund a king's war in return for monopolies that spanned continents. But royal favour was fickle. A change in regime could turn yesterday's favoured trader into today's accused traitor. Merchants learnt to navigate court intrigues as carefully as they haggled for grain, knowing when to speak boldly and when to bow deeply. Some merchants even became unofficial ambassadors, travelling to foreign courts to broker trade agreements or secure rare goods. Their polished manners and heavy purses often achieved what armies could not. Navigating crisis, war, famine, and plague. The medieval merchant faced threats far beyond market competition. War could destroy trade routes overnight. Famine could collapse demand. Plague could empty entire cities. Each disaster reshaped the map of commerce. Some merchants thrived in crisis, hoarding scarce goods and selling at desperate prices. Others saw their warehouses seized by rulers desperate for supplies. Risk management wasn't an academic exercise. It was survival. Yet with every catastrophe came opportunity. The Black Death, while devastating, left survivors with fewer competitors and greater demand. Merchants who endured rebuilt their fortunes swiftly, adapting to the changed world with the same agility that had always defined their trade, the enduring legacy. And so, beneath the banners of fairs, within the whispered halls of guilds, across stormy seas and dusty roads, the medieval merchant carved out a legacy not through war, but through trade. Their quiet ambition built cities, funded kingdoms, and planted seeds that would one day blossom into markets far beyond their narrow street. Yet this was only one chapter. Beyond the city gates, beyond the familiar stalls and toll bridges, stretched a far greater web of trade, a network that spanned continents, languages, and empires. For every coin exchanged at home, there were ships braving distant shores, caravans crossing endless deserts, and deals struck under foreign stars. Let us now follow these threads outward, to where silk meets spice, scrolls cross borders, and merchants become the silent ambassadors between worlds. Silk, scrolls, and silver, the rise of intercultural trade. Beyond the comfort of guild halls and city markets, an even grander stage awaited, the vast arteries of long-distance trade. Here, the medieval merchant did not haggle over wool or wine, but whispered across cultures. The Silk Road, twisting like a great serpent across mountains and deserts, carried not only fabrics, but fragile trust. Each caravan, laden with spices, porcelain or lapis lazuli, stitched the east to the west one cautious deal at a time. The art of trade here required not merely coin, but fluency in a dozen customs. A Persian merchant might greet with poetry, while a Chinese broker weighed silk like handling rare fruit. Contracts were written in multiple tongues, sealed with wax, and sometimes backed by little more than honor. A single cracked amphora could spark years of negotiation or feud. Yet the merchant endured. In caravansary courtyards under foreign stars, over shared dates and tea, they became ambassadors without banners. While kings warred, merchants bartered. Faith and finance, the merchant and the moneylender. But even trade across borders could not function without the quiet heartbeat of finance. Where coin was scarce, credit whispered promises, and where Christian law frowned upon lending with interest, Jewish financiers and Lombard bankers stepped forward, both respected and resented. Jewish communities, scattered yet deeply connected, became indispensable in money lending, their ledgers impeccable, their risk calculations legendary. They funded trade ventures and royal debts alike, though their security depended on fragile royal protection, easily broken by jealousy or political tides. Meanwhile, in the marble counting houses of Florence, Venice, and Genoa, merchant families like the Medici mastered not only trade but banking itself. They invented letters of credit, allowing a merchant to withdraw funds in one city deposited weeks earlier in another. Trust was no longer stored in heavy chests but written on thin parchment, an invisible thread binding distant ports into a single market. The sea's promise, maritime trade and piracy. If land routes were tedious, the sea offered both fortune and terror. A single ship could carry 10 caravans worth of goods, but also vanish beneath one cruel wave. Yet, the temptation of salt, sugar, pepper, and gold outweighed the risk. From the grey Hanseatic ports of the Baltic to the bustling docks of Alexandria, maritime empires flourished. Merchants became investors in shipbuilding, navigation, and cargo insurance, an early form of gambling wrapped in solemn contract. And then there were the pirates. Some were romantic rogues, others extensions of states themselves. Privateers carried royal commissions, corsairs flew ambiguous flags. For a merchant, each voyage was a delicate wager, not just against storms, but against men with swords and no interest in paperwork. The merchant as cultural bridge. Yet beyond goods and gold, merchants carried something more profound: ideas. As they moved between worlds, they brought back not just silk or saffron, but knowledge. They translated texts, carried maps, spread inventions. A new navigation tool from Arabia might quietly pass into a Florentine shipyard. An herbal remedy from India might find its way into a London apothecary. In this way, merchants became the invisible threads connecting civilizations. They taught Europe of Chinese porcelain, introduced Arabic numerals, carried paper-making westward. They were the quiet midwives of the Renaissance, long before scholars gave it a name. And so, even as kings made war, merchants made bridges. Bridges of commerce, language, and fragile, priceless understanding. The birth of early corporations. By the 12th century, the merchant's world was growing too vast for any single purse. In Genoa and Venice, shrewd traders began pooling their fortunes into shared ventures. These early joint undertakings allowed many investors to own slices of a ship's precious cargo. If the voyage returned safely, profits were handsome, But if storms or pirates claimed the vessel, the loss was shared among many shoals. This spread of risk gave merchants courage to sail farther, chase rarer goods, and transform risky adventures into calculated enterprises. With every successful journey, their ambitions swelled, and so did their networks of partners. Across growing trade routes, paper quietly replaced heavy coin. In distant Alexandria, a Venetian merchant might need funds, but gold was cumbersome, dangerous to transport. Instead, letters of credit were drawn up, beautiful documents inked with promises and sealed with family crests. In Bruges or London, a partner could present this parchment and receive payment as if coin had travelled with him. These pieces of paper floated across Europe like invisible ships of fortune, powered by nothing but trust, meticulous bookkeeping, and the weight of a merchant's name. As trade flourished, certain families rose far beyond simple buying and selling. In Augsburg, the Fugger family financed emperors. In Florence, the Medici funded popes. Their counting houses hummed with scribes recording deals that spanned kingdoms. No longer mere traders, they became kingmakers. Their wealth-buying influence few noble bloodlines could match. Behind palace walls, their advice was sought, their favours curried, and their debts feared. Quietly, these merchant dynasties rewrote the rules of power, proving that ledgers could command armies, even when swords stayed sheathed. Trust sat at the heart of this expanding world. A single broken agreement could collapse entire networks of commerce. Merchants guarded their reputations fiercely. Seals grew elaborate, notaries became essential, and contracts stretched for pages. Despite superstition and war, the medieval marketplace birthed an intricate system of finance, remarkably modern in its complexity. Though kings ruled by blood and blade, merchants ruled by promise, and for those who mastered this invisible currency, the rewards were boundless. The invention of insurance and the birth of financial safety nets. As trade routes grew longer, so too did the risks. One rogue wave could sink months of planning. One storm could scatter fortunes across the seafloor. And so, by the 14th century, merchants sought new protection: insurance. In the taverns of Genoa and the counting houses of Florence, deals were struck. For a fee, financiers promised to cover losses if disaster struck. Ship owners could now gamble boldly, knowing that even if the sea turned cruel, their ruin was not total. And, like trade itself, this too became a thriving business, a wager upon a wager. The terms of these policies were often complex, scribbled in careful Latin. Insurance agents inspected cargo, verified manifests, and evaluated routes. A ship bound for the stormy North Sea carried a higher price than one hugging the calm Mediterranean coast. And as competition grew, clever brokers found ways to spread risk across multiple investors, birthing the first syndicates that would one day evolve into modern insurance giants. Soon, entire markets emerged to support these agreements. In the port of Bruges, merchants gathered beneath vaulted halls, swapping not only goods but policies. News of shipwrecks travelled faster than caravans. Rumours of pirate activity in the Channel could shift rates overnight. Information became priceless, and some merchants paid well for early whispers, even employing agents to watch harbours, count sails, and quietly record arrivals. This fragile safety net changed everything. Merchants once crippled by fear now dared reach for distant shores. Spices from the Indies, silk from Cathay, and silver from the New World began appearing with growing frequency. Commerce no longer belonged only to the reckless, it now welcomed the calculated risk-taker. And behind every daring voyage stood ledgers, contracts, and cautious men with quills, gambling not with swords, but with ink. Tales of merchants who changed history. In the bustling streets of Venice, young Marco Polo prepared for a journey that would span decades. In 1271, alongside his father and uncle, he set off toward the mysterious East. Crossing deserts, mountains, and foreign courts, the Polos reached the court of Kublai Khan. There, Marco witnessed wonders few Europeans had ever imagined: porcelain palaces, paper money, and bustling cities lit by lanterns. When he finally returned to Venice in 1295, his tales inspired merchants and explorers for generations, hinting at the vast riches that lay beyond familiar maps. In Florence, the Medici family turned banking into an art form. By the early 15th century, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici had expanded his small bank into an international powerhouse. His son, Cosimo, grew the family's influence beyond finance, becoming the de facto ruler of Florence. The Medici financed cathedrals, funded artists, and negotiated with popes. Their wealth secured not only political power, but also sparked a flourishing of art and culture that would blossom into the farther north, in Augsburg, Jakob Fugger rose from modest cloth merchant to Europe's richest financier. In the early 16th century, he bankrolled the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, funded wars, and secured mining rights that filled his coffers with silver and copper. With quiet precision, Fugger manipulated markets, influenced royal marriages, and even advised popes. While knights fought on muddy battlefields, Fugger's ink reshaped empires from behind polished counting tables. In Bruges, international fairs attracted merchants from England, France, Italy, and the Baltic. One such merchant, Francesco Dettini of Prato, kept meticulous letters detailing his deals in wool, olive oil, and dyes. In the late 14th century, his archives revealed the daily struggles and triumphs of a merchant's life, negotiating prices, navigating taxes, and coordinating shipments across vast distances. Long after his death, Dettini's letters offered historians a rare, intimate glimpse into the world of medieval commerce. The merchant's legacy across generations. As medieval markets matured, merchant families began thinking not just of voyages or seasons, but of dynasties. Fortunes built on saffron and silk were carefully invested into land, titles, and marriages. Sons were trained from childhood to read ledgers as fluently as prayers. Daughters, often dismissed by chroniclers, negotiated dowries that tied trade houses together like stitched seams on a bolt of cloth. Wealth became hereditary, passing smoothly through ledgers and wills, transforming temporary prosperity into lasting power. By the 16th century, some merchants had risen higher than nobles. The lines between commerce and aristocracy blurred. Merchant princes built palaces that rivaled castles, funded universities, and sponsored voyages that redrew the map of the known world. The Renaissance itself thrived on their patronage. Behind every great artist stood a wealthy patron. Behind every cathedral dome, a merchant's ledger balanced carefully between piety and profit. In their wills, merchants displayed both caution and ambition. Some left detailed instructions: which son should inherit which venture, which debts should be forgiven, which rivalries should be mended. Others founded charitable trusts, hospitals, or schools, ensuring their names endured not only through wealth, but through public memory. Even in death, the merchant's mind remained calculating, turning coin into legacy and reputation into immortality. And so, as Europe stepped into the age of exploration and colonization, it carried with it centuries of merchant ambition. The quiet calculations of medieval traders had built the scaffolding for global empires to come. Though knights, kings, and conquerors often filled the pages of history, The patient hands of merchants quietly stitched the threads that bound the world together. The merchant spies, secrets behind trade. In the quiet corners of medieval trade, knowledge was as valuable as silk or gold. Merchants didn't just move goods, they moved secrets. A trader who knew which port was short on grain, which noble house was drowning in debt, or which route was suddenly plagued by bandits, held power few armies could match. Information flowed like whispered currents beneath the surface of commerce, gathered not by diplomats, but by innkeepers, sailors, and hired informants. In busy port cities like Constantinople or Alexandria, merchants paid generously for gossip. Dock workers were questioned, clerks bribed, and foreign envoys followed. Even religious pilgrims sometimes served as accidental informants, their naive conversations overheard in noisy markets. A single whispered rumour of an incoming spice fleet could spark price fluctuations weeks before the ships even arrived. Some merchants employed full-time agents, men who spoke multiple tongues, blended into foreign markets, and gathered valuable whispers. These spies reported on shifting alliances, unstable rulers, or new tariffs. Occasionally they uncovered plots to sabotage rivals or intercept cargo before it reached port. For ambitious merchants, trade was never just about goods. It was about positioning, prediction, and silent manipulation of the board long before pieces visibly moved. Yet this world of quiet espionage was perilous. A captured agent could implicate an entire trade house. Rival merchants hired their own counter-spies, feeding false information to destabilize competitors. The merchant's world was a chessboard played in shadows, where one carefully placed rumor could bankrupt a dynasty before the first coin ever exchanged hands. Forbidden goods and black markets. Not all goods crossing medieval borders were welcomed by kings or clergy. Beneath the bustling fairs and orderly guild stalls lurked a shadowy underworld of forbidden trade. Luxury items banned by religious edicts, rare manuscripts declared heretical, or exotic substances feared for their supposed magical powers quietly slipped through secret channels. Where there were bans, there were buyers, and where there were buyers, clever merchants saw opportunity. Smuggling networks flourished across both land and sea. In coastal villages, fishing boats made midnight exchanges with foreign ships, slipping contraband ashore beneath moonless skies. Inland, hidden compartments in wagons carried banned relics, spices, or even human cargo. Corrupt customs officers turned blind eyes for generous bribes, while entire monasteries sometimes acted as silent warehouses, hiding forbidden texts behind holy facades. The church's prohibition on certain luxury goods only fueled their desirability. Silks dyed with forbidden pigments, Eastern perfumes rumoured to inspire lust, or ancient pagan artefacts fetched exorbitant prices among nobles eager to possess what others could not. Even saints' relics, real or forged, moved through black markets sold to pious lords hoping to attract pilgrims and their coin. But with great profit came great danger. When discovered, smugglers faced heavy fines, public shame, or worse. Guild memberships were revoked, reputations shattered. Yet for some merchants, the reward outweighed the risk. In this twilight world of forbidden trade, survival belonged to those who mastered the fine art of discretion, silence, and knowing which judges could be bought. Women. Merchants' quiet power in a man's world. Though medieval chronicles often sang only of kings and male merchants, women quietly steered much of the commercial world behind the scenes. In market stalls, behind guild doors, and across distant trade posts, Countless wives, widows, and daughters negotiated deals, managed books, and protected family fortunes with sharp minds disguised behind polite smiles. Commerce for many families was a partnership, one in which women's influence was both vital and often unrecorded. In many cities, guilds permitted widows to inherit and operate businesses after their husbands' deaths. These women became seasoned negotiators, respected not only for their loyalty, but for their keen understanding of markets. Some expanded their enterprises far beyond what their husbands had built. Wealthy merchant widows in Florence and Bruges ran fleets of ships, financed construction of churches, and even negotiated directly with royal courts. Daughters, too, were trained from an early age. They memorized currency exchanges, weighed spices with practiced hands, and evaluated cloth quality by touch alone. Marriages were often strategic mergers, uniting merchant houses into stronger alliances. A well-darried daughter could become the key to expanding family influence, her household managing multiple branches of trade through subtle, well-maintained correspondence with brothers, uncles, and sons. Though barred from formal power in guild councils or state offices, many women merchants wielded quiet authority through networks of kinship, trust, and reputation. Their decisions shaped fortunes across generations. They balanced risk with pragmatism, understanding that one failed shipment could undo years of careful growth. Their names may rarely appear in dusty ledgers, but their hands steered many a merchant dynasty safely through uncertain tides. Merchants and religion, pilgrimage or profit. In medieval Europe, faith was everywhere, etched into laws, crowned into kings, and stitched into daily life. Yet for merchants, religion was not only devotion, it was also opportunity. Pilgrimages filled roads with travelers eager to reach sacred shrines, creating bustling markets along every major route. Inns, smiths, clothiers, and spice sellers thrived as waves of pilgrims paused to refresh both body and purse before continuing their holy journeys. Merchants shrewdly adapted to this steady stream of travelers. Special pilgrimage fairs emerged, offering relics, tokens, blessed charms, and indulgences. Some were genuine, many were not. Pilgrims bought tokens to prove their devotion, while merchants quietly counted the profit. In Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, entire economies flourished around the ceaseless flow of the faithful. Churches themselves became powerful commercial hubs. Monasteries traded wine, honey, manuscripts, and even medicinal herbs grown in their gardens. Some monasteries operated vast vineyards or controlled wool production across entire regions. High-ranking clergy partnered with merchant guilds, blending piety with profit. Behind the solemn chants echoed the subtle clinking of coin. Yet this close dance between commerce and faith was not without tension. Accusations of simony, exploitation, and heresy arose whenever profit appeared to overshadow piety. But the merchants understood. As long as pilgrims walked, as long as relics glittered, commerce would bloom beneath cathedral spires. In medieval Europe, God and gold often travelled hand in hand. The merchant's code of ethics, honour among thieves? Though many saw merchants as shrewd and slippery, a surprising code of ethics quietly governed medieval trade. Reputation was everything. A man known for cheating weights or forging contracts might profit briefly, but soon find doors closed, partners lost, and guild protection revoked. In tight-knit merchant communities, word travelled faster than any wagon. Guilds enforced these unwritten rules with an iron grip. Disputes were mediated behind closed doors to avoid public scandal. Honest mistakes were forgiven if swiftly corrected, but deliberate fraud invited harsh penalties, heavy fines, public humiliation, or permanent expulsion. An expelled merchant became a wanderer, stripped of networks that once guaranteed his safety. Yet the line between clever deal-making and dishonesty was often thin. Merchants practiced acceptable deception, strategic pauses, feigned surprise, and carefully crafted flattery. Stretching the truth was expected, breaking it was not. Even rival traders respected one another's craft, understanding that today's opponent might be tomorrow's partner on a riskier venture. This fragile balance created an odd sense of honor among merchants. They navigated a world where trust was both weapon and shield. Beneath the surface games, most merchants understood. In a world built on promises, one's word was ultimately more valuable than any chest of coin. Lose that, and no clever bargain could save you. The merchant's network, letters, couriers, and secret codes. In a world without telegraphs or fast ships, the medieval merchant's true power lay not only in goods but in information. Across Europe and beyond, vast networks of couriers crisscrossed dangerous roads, carrying letters that shaped markets long before ships arrived. A single, well-timed message could shift prices in Venice while a cargo vessel was still weeks from port. These letters were far more than friendly notes. Meticulously written in coded language, they detailed cargo manifests, currency shifts, local gossip, and political tremors. Rival merchants often sought to intercept these couriers, bribing or ambushing riders on lonely roads. To counter this, some trading houses developed primitive ciphers, simple code systems only trusted partners could decipher. Couriers became highly valued professionals. Trusted messengers carried multiple letters under false covers to disguise valuable intelligence. Some traveled disguised as pilgrims or monks, blending into the steady stream of travelers moving along trade routes. Their safety often depended not on speed, but on secrecy and discretion. In certain merchant families, only a handful of senior members could fully read these coded reports. Apprentices learned gradually, mastering basic trade before being trusted with the subtle language of encrypted letters. For the shrewdest merchants, knowledge wasn't just power, it was armor, shielding them from rivals who prowled the edges of every transaction. Merchant guild conflicts, rivalries, and sabotage. Beneath the polished veneers of guild halls and polite negotiations, rivalries simmered like hidden embers. Merchant guilds jealously guarded their privileges, controlling who could trade, set prices, or access valuable ports. Competing guilds often clashed, not with swords, but with whispers, legal traps, and carefully orchestrated economic sabotage. In many cities, powerful guilds formed alliances with local rulers, securing exclusive rights while freezing out competitors. Foreign merchants arriving in a prosperous town might find themselves blocked by labyrinthine regulations, sudden taxes, or inspectors eager to find faults. These were not random obstacles, they were deliberate barriers designed to protect local interests. Sometimes guild rivalries escalated into open conflict. In London, cloth merchants clashed with foreign wine traders. In Lubeck, Hanseatic factions maneuvered fiercely for control over Baltic routes. Spies infiltrated guild councils, secret deals were struck to undercut prices, and skilled saboteurs spread rumors to collapse rivals' credit. The battlefield was the marketplace, and every handshake concealed calculated maneuvering. Yet amidst the competition, an unspoken balance endured. If sabotage went too far, trade itself suffered. Guild leaders knew that occasional skirmishes maintained dominance, but total war destroyed prosperity. Thus, rival merchants performed their tense dance. competing ruthlessly by day, raising goblets together by night, understanding that survival required both aggression and restraint. Maritime law and the merchant courts. The sea offered great riches, but it was also a lawless expanse where disputes easily turned violent. To bring order, merchants developed their own system of maritime law, an evolving set of rules known across ports as the law of the sea. These codes governed contracts, cargo claims, and even the division of salvage from shipwrecks. Justice had to move swiftly, for delayed decisions could ruin entire ventures. In major port cities like Barcelona, Bruges, and Genoa, specialized merchant courts handled these cases. Panels of seasoned traders, rather than kings or priests, judged disputes. They understood the risks of storms, the temptations of piracy, and the fragile nature of shipping agreements. Their verdicts balanced fairness with the harsh realities of maritime commerce. When ships went missing or arrived damaged, bitter arguments flared between owners, insurers, and cargo investors. Was the captain negligent? Had the crew stolen part of the shipment? Were false manifests filed? Testimonies were weighed, logbooks examined, and witnesses summoned from distant ports. These courts became laboratories of early international law, shaping legal traditions that still echo in modern shipping codes. Yet even here, bribery and influence crept in. Powerful merchants swayed verdicts with subtle gifts, while rival houses maneuvered to discredit opposing captains. Still, compared to royal courts bogged down in politics, merchant courts often delivered faster, more practical justice. On the high seas of trade, efficiency was survival, and for medieval merchants, that mattered above all else. And so, the final entry is made. The ink dries on the parchment, the heavy ledger is closed, its clasp clicking softly into place. Outside, the last candle in the Guildhall window is extinguished. The market square, once alive with the day's haggling, now holds only silence and moonlight. The accounts are settled. The day's work is done. There are no more deals to be made, no more risks to be weighed, only the quiet promise of rest. Let the silence of the empty streets be your comfort. Let the weight of history be your blanket. It is time to sleep. Rest now. And so a stillness descends. The heavy ledger is closed. But perchance, for some, the mind has not yet settled. Perchance you linger still on the threshold of sleep and require a deeper, more profound quiet. If you are still here listening, then let us remain a while longer, not to witness a new story, but to observe the quiet work that made the previous story possible. We shall not travel, we will only look closer and more slowly at the objects and processes so often overlooked. Allow your breath to slow even further. There is no longer any need for hurry. The quiet work, the ledger and the quill. Let us consider the ledger that the merchant has just closed. It is not merely a book, it is a tool, a work of craft, a world of order. Its cover is of thick calfskin leather, darkened and softened by years of handling. The corners are bound in brass to protect them from wear. Upon opening it, one finds that the pages are not paper, they are vellum, made from processed calfskin. Each page feels cool, smooth, and slightly heavy to the touch. Its surface is not a stark white, but a creamy ivory, with the faint ghostly marbling of the original hide still visible. Before any script could be applied, the merchant or his clerk had to prepare the page. Using a small knife and a straight edge, he would gently scrape the surface to ensure it was perfectly smooth. Then, using an instrument called a pricking wheel, he would create a series of tiny, regular holes down the margins of the page. Next, with a silver point stylus and the straight edge, he would connect these holes, creating faint, ruled lines to ensure his handwriting would be perfectly straight. It was a patient, silent task. Then came the ink. The most common ink was iron gall ink, made from a complex recipe. Oak galls, small, hard growths on oak trees, were crushed and soaked in rainwater or wine. To this, iron sulfate or vitriol was added. Upon exposure to air, this mixture would oxidize and darken to a deep, permanent black. Finally, gum arabic was added to thicken the ink and help it adhere to the quill. It had a faint, sharp scent of iron and earth. The quill itself was fashioned from the flight feather of a goose or swan. The clerk would use a sharp knife, a penknife, to skillfully carve the tip, creating a sharp point with a tiny slit down the middle to hold a reservoir of ink. The cutting of the quill was an art in itself. A well-cut nib could write for hours before needing to be recut, and then the merchant would write. The quill would dip into the ink, the nib would touch the vellum, creating a quiet, steady scratching sound. His handwriting was a form of commercial Gothic script, angular and slightly dense, designed for speed while remaining legible to the initiated. Each number, each commodity, each debt, each credit was recorded with meticulous care, column by column, line by line, everything in its proper place. It was a ritual of order, a quiet attempt to impose structure on the chaotic world of buying and selling. The steady, scratching sound of the quill on vellum, regular, repetitive, in the flickering candlelight. The journey of wool within that ledger, one of the most frequently recorded commodities, was wool. Let us follow the journey of a single bale of wool from the back of a sheep to its place as a valuable commodity: the shearing. In the spring, as the weather warmed, the flocks of sheep would be driven into pens for shearing. The shearers used large, cumbersome iron shears. The work required both strength and skill. The shearer would hold a nervous sheep firmly between his knees. The blades of the shears would make a rhythmic snip-snip sound as they moved close to the animal's skin. Great swaths of greasy, matted wool would fall to the floor. This raw fleece was full of dirt, twigs, and a natural grease called lanolin. Its scent was pungent, an animal scent of the pasture. Washing and carding. The raw fleeces were then taken to a nearby stream for washing. Women would submerge the greasy wool in the cold running water, treading upon it with their feet and using wooden rakes to beat out the debris. After several washings and being laid out to dry in the sun, the wool became much whiter and lighter. Next came the process of carding. The worker used 2 wooden paddles studded with iron teeth, known as carders. A tuft of wool was placed on one paddle and the other was drawn across it again and again. The motion was steady, repetitive. It teased the wool fibers apart, untangling them and aligning them into soft, straight strands. The result was a series of light, fluffy rolls of wool, called rolags, ready for spinning. Spinning and dyeing. The act of spinning was almost entirely the domain of women. Using a drop spindle or a spinning wheel, a spinner would draw out a thin, continuous thread from a rolag, while the rotation of the spindle or wheel twisted the fibers together, creating a strong, even yarn. It was a craft that required hours of seated work, with gentle, repetitive motions. The hum of the spinning wheel was a familiar sound in every household. The yarn was then dyed. Dyes were derived entirely from natural sources: a lasting blue from the woad plant, a rich red from the root of the madder plant, a bright yellow from the weld plant, Skeins of cream-coloured yarn were simmered in large vats of dye bubbling over a fire. After dyeing, they were washed again and hung up to dry, creating long, colourful lines of yarn. Weaving. The coloured yarn was then brought to the weaver. The loom was a complex wooden machine. The weaver would sit on a bench using his feet to operate pedals that raised and lowered the vertical threads, known as the warp. His hands would skillfully pass a shuttle carrying the horizontal weft thread back and forth between the warp threads. With each pass of the shuttle, he would use a part of the loom called a reed to beat the new thread tightly into the growing fabric. The sounds of the workshop were a steady mechanical rhythm, the click-clack of the shuttle, the creak of the loom's frame, and the solid thump of the reed. Inch by inch, the cloth was formed from thousands of individual threads. The coin and the scale. When the finished wool cloth was finally sold, the merchant would receive his payment in coin. Medieval currency was not simple. Most daily transactions were conducted with a silver penny, a small, thin coin. A common problem was the practice of clipping. People would use small snips to trim a tiny amount of silver from the edge of a coin. A single clipped coin might go unnoticed, but by doing this to hundreds of coins, a dishonest person could accumulate a significant amount of silver. Therefore, merchants had to be vigilant. Upon receiving a bag of coins, the merchant would pour them onto a wooden table. The sound of the silver coins clinking together was a soft metallic chime. He would run his fingers through them, feeling their weight and checking their edges. Any coin that felt too light or had an irregular edge would be set aside. To be certain, he would use a small balance scale. It was a delicate instrument, often made of brass with two small pans hanging from fine chains. On one pan he would place a standard weight marked with a guild or royal stamp. On the other he would place the coin. The arm of the balance would sway gently before settling. If the coin was of proper weight, the arm would be level. If not, it would tilt. One by one, he would test them. It was a slow, meticulous process that required absolute concentration. Once tested, he would arrange the coins into neat stacks of 10 and then 20. He would place them in a heavy leather pouch with a drawstring. For larger sums, he would secure them in an iron-bound wooden chest with a complex lock. The sound of the metal lock clicking shut was a heavy, final sound. The money was secure. Another day's work was done. Everything had been counted, recorded, and put away. The unseen foundations. The Cooper's art. The world in a barrel. The coins are now locked away, silent and secure. But the wealth they represent depends entirely on the safe transport of goods. And in the medieval world, the most essential vessel for this transport, the unsung hero of global trade, was the barrel. Let us turn our attention now to the cooper's workshop, a place filled with the scent of sawdust and heated oak, where patience and brute force are combined to create these vital containers, the wood and the seasoning. The cooper's work begins not in his workshop, but in the forest, years before a single barrel is made. He does not use just any wood. For wine, spirits, and other valuable liquids, only the finest oak will do. He would select a tall, straight-grained oak, one that has grown slowly in a dense forest, ensuring its wood is tight and without flaws. After the tree is felled and split into rough planks called staves, the most important process begins: seasoning. The staves are stacked outdoors in neat crisscrossing piles that allow air to circulate around every piece, and there they sit for 1 year, 2 years, sometimes 3. They endure the sun of summer, the frost of winter, and the drenching rains of spring and autumn. This long, slow process leaches the harsh tannins from the wood, mellows its character, and ensures that when it is finally shaped, it will not warp or crack. It is a testament to the cooper's foresight, a slow investment in future quality shaping the staves. When the wood is finally ready, the cooper brings the seasoned staves into his workshop. Each stave must be perfectly shaped. It must be wider in the middle and tapered at both ends. It must also be devilled on its inner and outer edges at a precise, calculated angle, so that when placed next to its neighbours it forms a perfect, leak-proof circle. The cooper uses a specialised tool called a draw knife. He places a stave on a shaving horse, a type of workbench he sits on, using his feet to clamp the wood in place. Then, drawing the long, two-handled blade towards himself, he shaves off long, fragrant curls of oak. The work is rhythmic, physical, and requires immense skill. He does not measure with a ruler, but with his eye, his hands, and a lifetime of experience. He checks the curve, the taper, and the bevel over and over again, his movements economical and certain. For a single barrel he might need to shape 30 or more staves, and each one must be a near-perfect mirror of the others. Raising the barrel. Once the staves are shaped, the cooper begins to raise the barrel. He stands a temporary iron hoop on the floor. One by one, he places the staves inside this hoop, their bottom ends fitting snugly together. Slowly, a circle of wood rises from the floor, looking like a wide, open-ended wooden flower. He places more temporary hoops around this loose structure to hold it in place. At this stage, the barrel is only half formed, a splayed-out construction wider at the top and bottom than it will be in its final form. The dance of fire and iron. Now comes the most dramatic part of the process, a transformation using fire. A small iron brazier filled with burning wood shavings is placed inside the open barrel. The heat begins to warm the oak staves. As the wood heats up, the cooper sprinkles water on the outside of the barrel. The combination of heat on the inside and moisture on the outside makes the rigid oak wood surprisingly pliable. As the wood begins to steam, smelling richly of toast and vanilla, the cooper places a heavy rope or a wire cable around the splayed-out end of the barrel. Using a winch, he begins to slowly tighten the cable. With a great groaning and creaking of wood, the staves are gradually bent inwards, drawn together into the iconic, bulging barrel shape. While the wood is still hot and pliable, he takes the permanent iron hoops, which have been heated in a forge until they glow a dull red, and hammers them down over the ends of the barrel. As the iron cools, it shrinks, clamping the staves together with immense, unyielding pressure. The sound in the workshop is a cacophony of rhythmic hammering, the hiss of steam, and the protesting groan of bending wood. Sealing and finishing. The barrel is now formed, but it is not yet finished. The cooper must cut a groove called a croze into the inside edge of the barrel at both ends. Into this groove, the barrel heads, the flat circular top and bottom pieces will be fitted. The heads themselves are made of several flat planks of oak, joined together with dowels and sealed with rushes or reeds. The cooper then planes the outside of the barrel smooth, removing any rough spots. Finally, he drills a bunghole for filling and emptying the barrel. The final test is to fill it with water and let it sit, checking meticulously for any tiny leaks. Only when he is certain that it is perfectly sealed, perfectly strong, and perfectly made will he brand it with his personal mark, a symbol of pride in a job that demanded years of preparation and hours of intense, skillful labour. The guild's decree, the grammar of work. The cooper, like most skilled craftsmen, was not an independent agent. He was a member of a guild, a powerful institution that governed every aspect of his professional life. Let us now turn our attention from the physical workshop to the silent, rule-bound world of the guild hall. The apprentice's indenture. A boy's journey to becoming a master craftsman began with a formal contract, the indenture of apprenticeship. This was not a simple handshake. It was a legal document, written by a notary on a sheet of parchment. The parchment would be written out twice, side by side. Then it would be cut in half, with a jagged, tooth-like or indented line. The master kept one half, the apprentice's family the other. Only by fitting the two jagged edges together could the authenticity of the contract be proven. The text of the document was dense with legal language. It would state the length of the apprenticeship, often 7 years, sometimes as long as 10. It would bind the master to specific duties, to provide the boy with food, lodging and clothing, to teach him the art and mystery of the craft, and to provide moral and spiritual guidance. In return, the apprentice was bound to serve his master faithfully. He was forbidden from frequenting taverns, from gambling, from marrying, and from revealing the secrets of the workshop. He was, for the duration of his contract, a member of the master's household, his labour belonging entirely to the master, the journeyman's masterpiece. After his 7 or 10 years of service, the apprentice became a journeyman. He was now free to travel and work for other masters, earning a daily wage, but he was not yet a master himself. To achieve that status, he had to produce a masterpiece, a single piece of work that demonstrated his complete command of the craft, to be judged by the masters of the guild. The presentation of the masterpiece was a formal, nerve-wracking affair. The journeyman would bring his work, a perfectly sealed wine barrel, an intricately woven tapestry, a finely tooled leather saddle, to the guild hall. He would set it before a panel of senior masters. The masters, stern-faced and silent, would begin their inspection. They would not hurry. They would run their hands over the surfaces, checking for smoothness. They would examine the joints, looking for the slightest imperfection. They would measure the dimensions. They would tap the object, listening to the sound it made. They would discuss it amongst themselves in low, technical whispers. The journeyman would stand in silence, waiting. The deliberation could take an hour or more. Finally, they would render their judgment. If the piece was accepted, he would pay a hefty fee, swear an oath to uphold the guild's statutes, and be welcomed as a new master, finally able to open his own workshop. A meeting of the masters. Let us imagine a typical monthly meeting in the guild hall. The air is cool and smells of old wood and beeswax from the polished furniture. The master of the guild sits in a large carved chair at the head of a long table. The other masters are seated on benches along the sides. The guild clerk opens a heavy ledger and begins to read the minutes from the previous meeting in a low, even monotone. The topics discussed are not grand or dramatic. Master Thomas is fined 2 pence for selling 3 pairs of shoes after the market bell had rung for closing. The masters then debate a new petition. A member has requested permission to take on a 3rd apprentice, though the guild's statutes normally allow only 2. A long, quiet discussion ensues. One master argues it would give him an unfair advantage. Another argues that the master's eldest son is fighting in the king's war and he needs the extra help. A vote is taken by a show of hands. The petition is denied. The next item of business is the annual contribution for the wax to be used for the candles in the guild's chapel. The price of beeswax has risen and a lengthy, detailed discussion about the budget follows. This is the reality of the guild, the slow, quiet and meticulous administration of rules, traditions and finance. The chandler's light, a study in illumination. In a world governed by the sun, the creation of artificial light was a vital and respected craft. The chandler or candle maker worked with two primary materials, each with its own character and process: humble tallow and noble beeswax. The humility of tallow. For most households, the only affordable source of light came from tallow candles. Tallow was rendered animal fat, primarily from beef or mutton. The chandler's workshop often had a distinct, greasy and somewhat unpleasant smell. The process began with rendering the raw fat in a large cauldron over a low fire. The fat would slowly melt, and the impurities would be skimmed off the top. The resulting liquid tallow was a thick, yellowish, oily substance. The most common method of making tallow candles was dipping. The chandler would twist wicks from rushes or cotton fibers and hang them in rows from a wooden frame. He would then dip this entire frame of wicks into a vat of warm, liquid tallow and pull it out again. A thin layer of fat would cling to the wicks. He would let it cool and harden for a few minutes, then dip it again, and again, and again. For hours, the chandler would perform this slow, repetitive motion: dip, cool, dip, cool. With each dip, the candles would grow infinitesimally thicker. It was a laborious process that required immense patience. The finished tallow candles were soft, greasy to the touch, and when burned they produced a smoky, sputtering flame and a distinct meaty smell. The nobility of beeswax. Beeswax candles were a luxury reserved for churches and the wealthiest noble and merchant houses. Beeswax was a byproduct of honey production, and it was far more expensive than tallow. Its scent was clean and sweet, and when burned it produced a bright, steady and nearly smokeless flame. The chandler would first have to clean the raw beeswax by melting it in hot water, allowing the impurities to settle to the bottom. The clean, golden wax would then be ready, while beeswax candles could also be made by dipping. A more common method for high-quality candles was pouring. A wick would be hung inside a cylindrical metal mold. The chandler would then slowly and carefully pour the warm liquid beeswax into the mold. He had to pour at just the right speed to avoid air bubbles. The wax would then be left to cool and harden for many hours. Once solid, the candle would be removed from the mold, its surface perfectly smooth and uniform. These candles were a symbol of wealth and piety, their clean, bright light illuminating the most important spaces in the medieval world. The notary's seal, the currency of trust. In the complex world of trade, where a merchant's word was his bond, there was a need for something more permanent than a handshake. This need was met by the notary, a figure of immense importance who acted as a public witness and record keeper. The role of the notary. A notary was a public official authorized by the church or a secular authority to create and certify legal documents. His role was to translate a verbal agreement into a legally binding written contract. A merchant and his client would come to the notary's office, a small room often located near the town square. They would state the terms of their agreement aloud. The notary would listen intently, perhaps making quick notes with a stylus on a wax tablet. His most important skill was listening, and his most valuable asset was his reputation for impartiality and meticulous accuracy. The anatomy of a contract. After hearing the terms, the notary would begin to draft the formal document on a sheet of parchment. These contracts followed a strict, predictable formula. It would begin with an invocation in the name of God, Amen, and the date. It would then state the names of the parties involved. The main body of the contract would describe the transaction in painstaking detail, the precise quantity and quality of the goods, e.g. 100 bolts of fine woolen cloth from Flanders, dyed in the colour of woad blue, free of tears or imperfections, the agreed-upon price and the currency to be used, the terms of delivery, including the location and the deadline, and the penalties for failing to meet the terms of the agreement. The language was formal, repetitive, and left no room for ambiguity. The witness and the seal. Once the document was written, the notary would read it aloud to the parties to ensure it accurately reflected their agreement. Then the parties, along with one or two other credible witnesses, would affirm the document. They did not always sign their names, as literacy was not universal. Instead, they would make their mark. The most important part of the certification was the notary's own sign and seal. Each notary had a unique, elaborate hand-drawn symbol, his signum, which he would draw at the bottom of the document. He would then drip hot wax onto the parchment and press his personal seal into it, creating a permanent raised impression. This seal was his guarantee that the document was authentic and had been created under his official supervision. The finished contract was a powerful object, a physical manifestation of a promise secured by the combined authority of law, custom, and the notary's unimpeachable reputation. Final closing. All processes are now complete. The quill has been wiped clean, the ledger lies at rest, the coins are silent in the darkness of the chest, the bolt of wool awaits its new journey. All of this quiet work, these repetitive rhythms, are the steady foundation of the world we have observed. There is no drama, there are no surprises. Only patient labour, only order, imposed upon chaos. Let these images remain with you. The scratch of a quill on vellum, the hum of a spinning wheel, the steady thump of a weaver's loom, the soft clinking of silver coins. Let these quiet sounds dissolve into the stillness around you. There is nothing left to count, nothing left to write, nothing left to weigh. All work is done, all things are in their proper place, and now your mind too can be at rest, completely, deeply. Peace, sleep well.